morning to you, though.
All right, thank you very much for having me. Good
morning.
morning.
First of all, I just want you to just clear the air on the issue of you being a linguist and not a historian. What exactly about that?
Okay, yeah, so I received my PhD in linguistics back in the academic year 2012-2013, and I actually won the Vice Chancellor's Award for the best PhD thesis in that year. So again, that's in linguistics. While I do a lot of work in historical linguistics, there are all these different subjects. Now, for me, even though I study linguistics, what I claim is that I'm an African and I'm interested in African liberation. So even this idea of segmenting and compartmentalizing knowledge into these various disciplines, I'm not so much for that because my work is very interdisciplinary. When we're dealing with African liberation, we have to be very interdisciplinary. So I work in sections that some people would consider politics, in history, historical linguistics, so forth and so on. But for me as an African, I look at knowledge holistically, and I think to resolve our issues and problems as African people, it behooves us to look at these issues holistically and not in a fragmented manner.
Right, thank you very much, Doc. Are you an African?
Yes, I'm an African.
Are you an African?
Yes.
Are you sure you're African?
Yes.
You represent Africa on any day.
Yes, that's correct.
The food you eat, what you wear. In fact, what you wear is really a true reflection of that as a matter of fact. But I actually have an issue with your accent. If you're an African, why this accent? I really like the accent anyways, but if you're an African, why this accent?
Yeah. So my accent comes from my ancestors being enslaved 400 years ago. And once they were enslaved, this is where you had people who came from various parts of Africa. So you had Igbo people who were enslaved, you had Yoruba people who were enslaved, you had Akan people who were enslaved, you had Jollof people who were enslaved, you had Congo people who were enslaved. So because of all of those different influences, you come to the accent where it's actually representative of, you have aspects of Wolof. So if you look at how black people in the US speak, they use a lot of the schwa, which you find in Wolof pronunciation of various words. If you look at the overall pattern of speaking in terms of the stress on the penultimate syllable, that one actually you can find that in Bantu languages. So once you have a composite of various African groups, this is how you get to an accent such as mine. Now, there's a difference between being an African and a difference between being a fragment, right? So a lot of the accents that you have here on the continent are Ewe accents or Gan accents or, Dagbanli accents. So accents that are influenced by one particular ethnic group. So those are, I would say, a lot less African than the composite of all of them put together. You understand? So when I say African, I mean African in the truest sense, mean a combination of all these different people instead of just one teeny tiny fragment. So we should never privilege having an accent like one fragment as being more African than having a composite of all African people put together.
Right, thank you very much. I think I need to get an accent now because I'm a lover of accent. And initially I used to ask myself so many questions whether it's the best representation of who want to call myself an African. But anyways, I get the truth of it and I want to appreciate that. So for now, on the lighter note, I think I'll get an accent very soon.
No problem, you can work on it.
I think we should zoom straight into action.
Yeah.
So today is Independence Day, and just like we do on every other said march for Independence Day, there's marching, there are other activities to commemorate the day. But it's different this time around. This year we are having the Independence Day celebration in the northern regional capital of Ghana, that's Tamale, in remembrance as well for the solution to the Abu and Andani conflict that has longed so many years. And God being so good, and if I should say, earlier this year, more or less we've had peace among the Abus and Andanis of the northern region. And so I think it's just right and it's just a step in the right direction that the president thinks why that we should go there and commemorate the day. As the usual, where we have almost everything sent in the capital. I think moving on is going to be good if year by year the sitting president finding necessary to push it from one regional capital to the other, at least from some senses of participatory democracy, people feeling part of our Independence Day celebration, people feeling part of national issues and the national agenda on daily basis. But as far as you're in the studio, this is what we want to find from you.
No problem.
And the essence of Independence Day is still relevant in Ghana today. The essence of Independence Day. how relevant, first of all, is it relevant? And the second of it all, how relevant and how impactful is it to the everyday activities of each and every Ghanaian?
Right. So when we look at the linguistic breakdown of independence, the N stands for not, and then the dependence, meaning not dependent. And when we look at our situation as African people, it will be very hard to characterize our present situation as independence, not being dependent on anyone. And I think about this in terms of at a group level and at an individual level, many of us are conditioned and controlled by created tastes and desires, right, which are externally directed. And it comes up to a question of, are we doing things to meet our own needs or the needs of our enemies? And the oldest book in the history of the world was written in Africa. I'm not sure how many of your listeners are aware of that, but it's called The Instructions of Ptahhotep. And in that text it says, Il sejum en chetef nesu chefti, and it translates to, listening to one's appetite is but allegiance to the enemy. Translated another way, you can say, he who is ruled by his appetite belongs to the enemy. Now, this was repeated by Nana Thomas Sankara, who also said that he who feeds you controls you. Now, basically the idea is that you can control a person through their tongue, right? As a metaphor, saying that, you know, in the text it says through the belly, we can say through the tastes and desires that are created. And there's a quote, you know, you could translate that into Twi as, that if you listen to your stomach or your belly, then you belong to the enemy. So this is a text that is coming from over 4,350 years ago. This is before there was writing anywhere else. This is the very first writing system called Medunecha. And essentially what we're dealing with, are we dealing with independence, or are we dealing with neo-slavery and neo-colonialism? And essentially this boils down to consuming what you don't produce and producing what you don't consume, right? And we can see this on various levels. Now there is a noted psychologist named Nana Amos Wilson, and he says the essence of controlling people is to provoke a desire in them, and then of course have the control of the satisfaction of that desire. That's the foundation of the capitalist system and economic system. So one, you get people to desire certain things, whether that thing is the clothes, whether that thing is the food. So even if I look around the studio, it's very difficult for me to find Africans who are wearing African clothes, right? So who has put a desire in us for the clothes of other people, and who ultimately benefits from that? Another quote from the same ancestor, he says, oppression rests on people going places and enjoying pleasures that destroy them, and who are excited by nonsense and bored by the stuff that they should be learning. In this world where things are backwards, those who are oppressed must be made to feel freest when they are most enslaved. So even, you know, as we're going into this, you have people who are thinking that they are independent when we have flag independence, when we have, you know, a national anthem. But even we ask, are we even dependent of the technology? Because as I'm speaking, I have my colleagues who are on their phone. I don't know what they're doing. Yeah. But, you know, just the point of, are we actually interested in right and correct knowledge? Or are we interested in, you know, playing around? What's the newest video? What's this? What's that? You understand? And the quote from Nana Amos Wilson, he says, why does the black man say freedom is doing what I want to do? And why is it that everything that he so-called wants to do enriches the European, right? It's not happenstance. It's not just random that all the things that we say that we want to do as our own voluntary, you know, initiative just happens to be the things that enrich our oppressors and our enemies. So when we observe who benefits from our interests, tastes, and desires, we will see who implanted those interests, tastes, and desires in us for their ultimate benefit, right? So these are some of the things that we can think about in terms of the language, in terms of the food, the religion. So when I'm in Ghana, every time I look at the back of the trottoir, I see an imaginary white boy on a stick, and people are going to pray to this imaginary white boy every Sunday. Who convinced us to pray to this imaginary white boy? Those who are not praying to an imaginary white boy are praying to a rock in the desert somewhere in Mecca. You understand? So if it's not one or the other, we have to ask ourselves, how do either one of those things benefit African people? You understand? What does it do to us psychologically when we say the only son of the creator of everything looks like the exact same white boy who colonized us? You understand? Meanwhile, when you go to Western Eurasia, what they call Europe, you will see that they have between 400 and 500 images of Black Jesus and Black Mary in the Vatican, in Portugal and Spain, all over. You understand? So how come when they were coming to colonize and enslave us, they left all the black images there, and then they brought us these white ones that were commissioned under Alexander the Sixth. And the idea is that he used his illegitimate son, Cesare Borgia. When you read The Prince by Machiavelli, is based on Cesare Borgia. So that image didn't even come up until the late 1400s or 1490s to be precise, where you had these Renaissance artists who were commissioned to say, why are we worshiping images of black people? You know, let's change it and finally start worshiping images of white people. But we have to ask our question, when do we as African people get independent? So when I see all these black people, blacker than 1,000 midnights, who are worshiping the image of Cesare Borgia, who was a noted genocidal maniac, killer, incestuous, just about every single character flaw you can think of that was embodied in Cesare Borgia. But then this is the image that has been brought to us by our colonial enemies. So we can think about values, social relations, and our names. When I meet people on campus, I ask them, what's your name? If it's not Priscilla. Now, it took me a while to even know that Priscilla was the name that I knew as Priscilla. I was like, well, maybe it's a language I don't know. Maybe it's Ewe or something. And then I saw them spell. I said, oh, you don't even know how to pronounce this name that you're saying, but everyone mispronounces this name. They say Priscilla, Priscilla, Priscilla. I said, what is this? Now, we name our children here in Africa the names of dogs and of cats. You'll meet someone named Happy. You'll meet someone named Bright. It's like, how can you name your child this? You know, you should have a name that really speaks to who you are and points you on the road towards your destiny. But rather than doing that, it's like, let's just randomly open a dictionary. Okay, boom. Whatever I stick my finger on, that's going to be the name of my child. So these are some of the things that we have to think about in terms of independence, in terms of social relations, in terms of economics, in terms of culture. To what degree are we actually independent? And I would say that the economics that we think about are the concrete manifestation of social relations. And again, you see this in the work of Dr. Amos Wilson in his book, Blueprint for Black Power. Now, when we also think about culture, I think about African people as suffering from cultural AIDS, and I'll explain what I mean by that. When you say AIDS, this is an autoimmune deficiency syndrome, right? It means that the immune system is so broken down that anything can come in. And by way of analogy, I think this is our situation as African people, that we allow very permeable borders in terms of what is allowed to come in when it comes from a Eurasian, anyone who's white, whether it's a Gandhi statue on campus, whether it's a Confucius Institute on campus, whatever comes in, as long as it's not African, that's allowed in. But meanwhile, we have very strong borders and boundaries, because the first thing that you speak to a person, if I greet them, they'll say, oh, that's not my language. They'll say it to me in English. They'll say, that's not my language. Oh, why are you wearing this? That's not my, clothing. That's not, you understand? I had a colleague from Zambia who was like, he was wearing a suit and tie, and he saw me dressed as I dressed every single day of my life since I was 19 years old. I said, every day of my life, I'll wear clothes made by African people. So even my briefs are African. I got African prints, and I say, look at all these tailors and seamstresses. So once you have clarity that we need to produce what we consume and consume what we produce, that's where we start to emphasize that in terms of the expression of that will. I think you have something you want to come in with?
Sure. So basically, I think you've more or less enlightened us on exactly the essence of our question. That is it. But then on the other side, having experience, I went back in high school. I was in the cadets and reached the ranks of an officer. I can just really recollect the ordeals and the pain standing in the sun for a parade, normal parade, do you get it? Where I wait for dignitaries to come and sit down, come in after sitting down, do all the pleasantries, talk to them, follow all the protocols and procedures, and then now you're off to march. You have people at the level of 19 years, 18 years, 17 years, 16 years, falling off parade, you get it, lying down flat, and there are times where people even get some lifetime and health issues because of those incidents. That's aside, we go on year basis, we go to Independence Day parade and people are falling down. We have children from all walks of life and all ages falling down. Is it necessary that we continue to have these children be in the sun? Should we have the children continually marching in the sun on Independence Day? And what is the relevance attached to that particular activity?
Yeah, I think also what we see here is just imitating whatever we have Eurasians do. So we have a Eurasian created nation state, right? So essentially what you've gotten is a system that was set up by our colonial enemies. Some people say colonial masters. I never say that. I say colonial enemies because I like to be precise with the terminology I use. Now, you have a system that at that time The whole point of the government was to allow them to steal whatever they wanted from the soil without being accountable to anyone, right? So what we've done is that we've just taken out those white parts and then we put in black parts, and we expect the system to do something other than that. So we're magically, oh wow, how did this get to be corrupt? The entire system was set up to be corrupt, to steal gold, to steal cocoa, to steal timber, to steal all of these things without being accountable to anyone. So under the British, if you say, oh, you're taking our cocoa, who are you going to talk to? You understand? The system is set up for them to take the cocoa. And I think about like a refrigerator. Let's say I have a black refrigerator. I'll take out one black part and I'll replace it with the exact same part, but it happens to be white, or vice versa. You understand? I have a white refrigerator. I'll take out one part and I'll put in a black part that does the exact same thing. It's going to do the same thing. So it's like saying that the gun is broken because it's shooting people. You may not want it to shoot you, but that's what the gun was manufactured to do. So as long as we have these neo-colonial nation states that were set up by our colonial enemies to destroy African people, you have a system that's set up to destroy Africa and African people, and we've maintained this. You see the white wigs on the judges, you see all these things. So when you're imitating your Eurasian enemies, this is where you get these parades. You understand? Where can you find in Africa that we're doing parades on asphalt under the hot sun and whatever? You understand? If you're doing anything, you're doing things as traditional festivals, you're doing it in alignment with nature, it's surrounded by trees, you're in the ancestral grove, all of these things. So we preserve these aspects of nature because we know how important it is. Now, in the places where you're doing these parades, you've chopped down all the trees, you have asphalt, and you have these stands and stadiums. Who are you imitating? Who created a taste and a desire for doing these things? You understand? So this is what we're talking about when we say flag independence, national anthem, a coat of arms. Where are we getting these things from? You understand? If we actually knew our history, then we would understand that the very first nation state in the history of the world was called Kemet, and they didn't have the flags, they had the standards, right? So the standards is the exact same thing you see on Ochiampoma to this day. So on the Narmer palette, this is considered one of the oldest historical documents in the world. You see all of them holding staffs, and on the top you see the birds there, just like how you would see Akroma for the Oyoko, Achiampoma, all of these things. So this is what's ours, but we've been convinced to throw what's ours to the side and then take up our colonial enemies' things, and we're seeing the effects of it.
Thank you very much, Doc. We are very grateful for having you in there. Thank you very much, Doctor. We are very grateful for having you in the studio.
Okay.
It was an enlightening time where you've taught a lot about Independence Day and the relevance of Independence Day.
Okay.
And I'm just going to give you some short minutes to wrap up what you've listened so far.
All right, and so just the core of what I've been dealing with is we should be thinking about who originates a given thought, word, or behavior in any aspect of our lives. With that, we can also think about who benefits from a thought, word, or behavior. And then we have to think about what's the ultimate objective of African people, what are the consequences of any thought, word, or behavior that we engage in. Is it for African liberation, or is it for European oppression, or I'll say Eurasian oppression? And I want to close with what I would say is a very short case study in terms of are we independent or are we not independent. So there's a quote from Nana Malcolm X where he says, "Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research. When you see you've got problems, all you have to do is examine the historic method used all over the world by others who have problems similar to yours. And once you see how they get theirs straight, then you know how you can get yours straight." And I can think about this in terms of the United Snakes of America. Now, in the United Snakes, by 1816, it was the most, it had a 35% tax on imported manufacturers. This is called protectionism, which rose to 50% by 1832. Between 1864 and 1913, it was the most heavily protected nation on earth and the fastest growing. It wasn't until after the Second War, when it had already become top dog, that it dropped most of its tariffs. The same strategy was followed by Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and almost every other country that is rich today. Africans, on the other hand, allow anything to come in. And when you look at protectionism, you can also see it in the EU that denies 700 billion in export income a year to African countries. That's 14 times more than these countries receive in foreign aid. So we have to ask the question, are these countries that practice protectionism, like the US and the EU as a region, are they interested in what's best, or are they interested in what, helps them? Now, I want to use as this case study, let's look at the cars that presidents drive, right? If you look at China, they have limousines that's produced by the Hongqi brand, which is a Chinese brand. If you look at France, they have Citroën and Peugeot and Renault, which are French-made cars. This tells you that they are independent. What their leader drives, it tells you that they're independent because they're not interested in what's best. They're interested in what's theirs. If you look at German presidents, that they use the Mercedes-Benz S-Class or chancellors. If you look at the Empress of Japan and the Emperor of Japan, they have a Toyota Century Royal because that's made in Japan. If you look at the UK, the Queen Elizabeth II has Bentley State limousines. If you look at the President of the United States, they drive Cadillac. If you look at South Korea, they drive a Hyundai. If you look at the Italian president, they use a Lancia. Now, what does our president use? Does he use Kantanka? You understand? That's what intelligent people do. They don't care, is this the best thing in the world? They care, does my child have the opportunity to be the head of this assembly plant? Does my grandchild have the opportunity to work there? This is what we would do if we actually had independence. But when we don't have independence, we are dependent on the enemies of African people, then we do this. When I was in the US, you find that all the state and government cars are all US brands. They use Ford, they use Chevrolet for the police vehicles, for whatever, for ambulance, everything is made in the US. If you go to Germany, everything is going to be a Hyundai, whether it's a bus, whether it is a taxi, whatever, they're using their own brands. And you find this all throughout the world among independent people. But for us, we're importing the Toyotas, the Land Cruisers, the Lexus, whatever, you understand?
Yeah.
This tells us, just as a short case study, that we're not yet independent. So I'll close with a quote by Amilcar Cabral where he says, "The best way to fight an alien culture is to live your own." In the words of our ancestors, they say, "Samohonyakwa," that to serve yourself is not enslavement. And we have to start thinking about discipline and innovation are necessary. We should chart every thought, every word, and every action, and every area of activity to think about who originates that, who benefits from it, and to what end and what consequences. So in conclusion, I think we have to stop financing our own oppression, stop financing our enemies, and then start financing ourselves. If we look at the schnapps that we, say is traditional, it can't be traditional because what were we doing before the Dutch even came to our shores? So in our clothing and everything, we have to start thinking about if we actually want to be independent and we're not independent yet, then we have to support our own and stop supporting our enemies to consume what we produce and produce what we consume, because as the oldest book in the history of the world says, which was written in Africa, that he who listens to his belly belongs to the enemy. So thank you very much, Madam Wasia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Obadali Campbell. Dr. Obadali happens to be a linguist, if I'm right, and
I'm an African, if you're right.
And you are a fellow at the Institute of African Studies.
I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute of African Studies.
Sure. Thank you very much for coming. We are very grateful. And panelists, I think I have some few issues to discuss with you as far as the engagement is concerned. And Vanessa, on the issue of the relevance of Independence Day, is there any particular relevance of Independence Day?
As the doctor rightly said, I think we are actually imitating what our colonial oppressors actually introduced us to. And I agree with him, because most of the time when I see certain things like this, I channel to my Facebook page. I remember when